Let me ask you something. How many times have you watched The Shawshank Redemption? Maybe twice. Maybe 10 times. Maybe you've lost count entirely. You probably know the lines by heart. You know the ending. You know the feeling it leaves in your chest when the credits roll. And yet, if you're being honest with yourself, there's a good chance you've been watching this film with your eyes half open this entire time. Because here's what the cast and crew have been quietly revealing for decades in interviews, commentary tracks, and anniversary retrospectives. There are entire layers of this movie that most people, even the most devoted fans, have completely missed. Not just trivia. Not just fun facts. We're talking about deliberate artistic decisions baked into every frame, every performance, every line of dialogue that fundamentally change how the story reads once you know what to look for. Today, we're going deep. We're going to talk about what Morgan Freeman actually thought he was playing when he stepped into the role of Red. We're going to talk about why Tim Robbins kept his body unnaturally stiff in certain scenes, and completely relaxed in others, and why that matters more than you realize. We're going to talk about a subplot that nearly got cut entirely, a final scene that almost didn't exist, and a small detail about the weather in this movie that, once you see it, you absolutely cannot unsee. And before we're done, we're going to talk about why this film, which was considered a commercial disaster when it was released, ended up becoming arguably the most beloved movie ever made. So let's start at the very beginning. And I mean the very beginning. The Shawshank Redemption was released in September 1994. It opened against Pulp Fiction and Forrest Gump. Two films that were, at that moment, cultural explosions. By comparison, Shawshank was practically invisible. It earned around $16 million at the box office against a budget of $25 million. By Hollywood's math, that's a failure. The film came and went. Most people didn't see it. But the story of how it got made in the first place is just as unlikely as the story of how it found its audience afterward. Director Frank Darabont had spent years trying to break into Hollywood. He'd written screenplays. He'd done smaller projects. But his real passion was Stephen King's novella, Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, a story from King's 1982 collection Different Seasons. The story was quiet, interior, deeply psychological. Not the kind of King material that studios were lining up to adapt. No monsters. No supernatural terror. Just a man in a prison, and the slow, quiet insistence of hope. King had a practice at the time for up-and-coming filmmakers he believed in. He'd sell the rights to his shorter works for a symbolic payment, just $1, so that talented people could have a chance to make something without corporate interference strangling the project in its crib. Darabont qualified for that deal. He sent King a check for $1, and King cashed it. What that single dollar purchased was something invaluable: creative freedom. Because the studio didn't see enormous financial stakes in this project, Darabont was given more latitude than most directors ever get. He could cast who he wanted. He could make the film he saw in his mind. He could fight for the scenes that mattered, even when executives pushed back. And fight he did. Repeatedly. We'll come back to those fights, because several of them almost changed the film in devastating ways. Before we talk about the actors and what they've revealed about their performances, we need to talk about the location itself, because it shaped everything. The film was shot primarily at the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio. This was a real prison. A massive, Gothic, imposing structure that had been shut down just 4 years before cameras rolled, closed because conditions inside were deemed cruel and unconstitutional. Men had actually suffered inside those walls for over a century. When the cast arrived on location, something happened to all of them. Clancy Brown, who played the sadistic Captain Hadley, talked about it in interviews. He described walking through those gates each morning and feeling a kind of psychological weight that no movie set could manufacture. The misery was embedded in the stones. You didn't have to conjure it. It was already there. Tim Robbins took this even further. Between takes, he would sometimes go sit alone inside one of the cells. The cells were 6 feet by 8 feet. Barely larger than a parking space. When you stood inside one and the door closed, Robbins said, something primal happened in your brain. The panic wasn't performed. It was real. Here's a detail that most people genuinely don't know. Many of the extras in the film weren't actors at all. Frank Darabont specifically sought out men who had actually served time at that prison. He wanted their faces. He wanted the way they moved, the way they looked at guards, the way they sat in the yard. These men weren't acting when the cameras rolled. They were remembering. And that distinction shows up on screen in ways that are impossible to fake. There's also a production detail that almost no casual viewer ever catches. The walls of the prison were deliberately altered between scenes to reflect the passage of time. As the film moves through different decades of Andy's sentence, the production design team adjusted the grime, the paint, the wear on the walls to track time visually. It's so subtle that your brain registers it without your eyes ever consciously processing it. But it's there. And it contributes to the film feeling lived in and real in a way that pure set construction never could achieve. Here's something that separates good films from great ones. The best actors don't just play what's written on the page. They build entire worlds behind the words, entire histories for their characters that the audience never sees directly but always feels. Morgan Freeman has spoken at length about the backstory he created for Red, a backstory that goes far deeper than anything the film explicitly states. In Freeman's mind, Red was a man of stature before he came to Shawshank. Not a violent criminal by nature, but someone who ran numbers, who operated in the informal economies of the black community in the late 1930s and early 1940s. A fixer. A connector. Someone who understood how systems worked and how to make those systems work for him. That history explains everything about the way Freeman plays Red inside the prison. Red isn't surviving Shawshank. He's operating it. He knows who needs what, how to get it, who to approach and how to approach them. He has status. He has a network. And when he sees Andy Dufresne arrive, he recognizes something that nobody else does. He sees another man who once had position and power in the world outside, and lost it completely. That recognition is the beginning of everything. Tim Robbins' approach was even more architecturally complex. He has described building two entirely separate characters for Andy, not two sides of one person, but genuinely two distinct modes of being. There was the Andy that Shawshank saw, careful, controlled, measured, slightly distant. A man who gave nothing away. And then there was the other Andy, the one we only glimpse in private moments, the one who felt things fiercely, who planned obsessively, who refused to stop being himself even inside a machine designed to erase people. Robbins made this distinction physical. When Andy is in his public mode, in conversations with guards, in the yard, in front of the warden, Robbins held his body tight. His gestures were small. His face was contained. But in private moments, when he's alone in his cell, when he plays that opera record over the prison speakers, when he's doing something that is purely and secretly himself, his whole physical presence loosens and opens. Most viewers never consciously register this shift. But they feel it. And that feeling is the reason Andy Dufresne reads as a man with an interior life, rather than just a protagonist. James Whitmore, who played the elderly librarian Brooks Hatlen, drew his performance from somewhere intensely personal. The character of Brooks is only briefly mentioned in Stephen King's original novella. Darabont expanded the role significantly, and Whitmore brought something to it that wasn't in any script. He based Brooks's loneliness, his bewildered detachment from the outside world, on his own father, who suffered from depression in his later years after the death of Whitmore's mother. The moment where Brooks feeds birds in the park, that quiet, heartbreaking image of an old man with no one to talk to, that wasn't scripted. Whitmore suggested it, because he'd watched his own father do exactly that in real life. That kind of grief, that kind of invisible suffering, is what makes the Brooks subplot so devastating. It isn't melodrama. It's documentation. Darabont and his cinematographer Roger Deakins, one of the greatest directors of photography who has ever worked in film, constructed a visual language for this movie that operates almost entirely below the level of conscious thought. Most viewers absorb these choices emotionally without ever identifying them. Here's the one that Robbins himself has pointed out in interviews. Throughout the film, Andy is frequently framed behind bars, railings, fences, or barriers, in shots where other characters are not. This happens even in scenes where Andy isn't in a cell. He's in the yard and there's a chain link fence cutting across the frame in front of him. He's in the warden's office and the shadow of window bars falls across his face. He's on the roof during the beer scene and the ledge creates a visual cage around him. This is intentional. Darabont is telling you something visually that the script only hints at. Andy is imprisoned in ways that go beyond the physical walls. He's imprisoned by his innocence, by his refusal to accept the identity Shawshank wants to assign him, by the secret he's carrying for 19 years. The visual bars are a language. They say, this man is not free, even when he appears to be. Now here's where it gets richer. Pay attention to when those visual barriers disappear. They're essentially gone from Andy's escape sequence. When he's crawling through that pipe, when he's finally outside in the rain with his arms spread wide, the frame is open. Nothing between him and the camera. Nothing between him and the sky. Darabont removes the visual imprisonment at the exact moment Andy removes the physical one. Every film lover knows about the posters in Andy's cell. Rita Hayworth first, then Marilyn Monroe, then Raquel Welch. And almost everyone knows at some level that the posters are hiding the tunnel. But Robbins has explained in interviews that the posters are doing something else entirely, something that transforms them from a plot device into a piece of storytelling poetry. The posters are a timeline of Andy's emotional journey. Rita Hayworth belongs to the 1940s and early 1950s, the era when Andy arrives at Shawshank. She represents glamour and old Hollywood elegance, the world Andy came from. She is fully clothed, composed, cinematic in the classical sense. As time passes, the posters change. Marilyn Monroe arrives. She's from a slightly later era, more openly sensual, more psychologically complex, more culturally electric. The world is changing. Andy is changing. And finally, Raquel Welch, in her fur bikini from 1 million years BC, a film set in prehistory, a film about human beings before civilization existed. She represents something primal, something stripped of all the social construction that originally defined Andy's identity as a wealthy banker. By the time Raquel Welch is on that wall, Andy has been dismantling himself for years. He's shedding the layers. He's preparing to crawl through literal filth to emerge clean on the other side. Darabont confirmed this reading explicitly. The progression is intentional. The posters show Andy's movement toward a kind of radical freedom, a willingness to abandon everything, including the polished self-image he once prized, in order to survive. And when you understand that, the shot of the poster flapping in the wind after Andy escapes becomes something else entirely. It's not just revealing the hole in the wall. It's the final image of Andy letting go of everything he was before. This is the one that stops people cold when they hear it, because once you see it, you cannot go back. The weather in the Shawshank Redemption is not accidental. It is a storytelling instrument, deployed with surgical precision across the entire length of the film. Think about every moment of genuine darkness in the story. The night Andy is attacked by the sisters. The night Tommy Williams is killed on the warden's orders. The night the warden takes his own life when the police come knocking. Rain. Always rain. Sometimes a cold overcast grey. Sometimes a full downpour. The sky registers what's happening on the ground. Now think about Andy's escape. It happens during one of the most violent thunderstorms of the film. And here's what's interesting about that choice, the storm isn't just dramatic backdrop. It's the weather matching the enormity of what's happening. The most violent night in the film's sky coincides with the most violent act of liberation in the story. But here's where it becomes truly extraordinary. Think about the final scene. Red, walking across the beach in Mexico. Andy turning around. The two of them moving toward each other. The sky in that scene is not merely clear. It is luminously, almost impossibly blue. Warm sunlight saturates every frame. It is the only time in the entire film, across 2+ hours of story, that you see weather like that. Morgan Freeman has spoken about this in interviews. He noted that every outdoor scene in the film, with the exception of that final reunion, carries clouds, grey light, or active rain. The sun doesn't fully appear until the story is finally over, until the last prison has been left behind. The visual reward is withheld for 2 hours and then given all at once, and you feel it physically when it arrives. Here is something that most fans of the film have no idea about. One of the most emotionally crucial sequences in the Shawshank Redemption was not in the original cut of the film. It was added late, after the film had essentially been finished, after a fight with studio executives. The scene in question is the moment on the bus where Red, finally released from prison after decades inside, sits and narrates his decision to break parole and go find Andy in Mexico. It's the scene where he says that hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things. It's the scene where Red's entire internal journey crystallizes into a choice. Darabont has talked about this. The studio wanted to end the film with Red simply being released and heading toward the border, leaving the audience to wonder whether he and Andy would reunite. They felt the film was too long. They wanted to trim. They thought ambiguity was enough. Darabont disagreed completely. He argued that without that bus scene, without seeing Red actively choose hope rather than just passively moving toward it, the film's emotional architecture collapses. The whole point of the story, he said, isn't just that Andy escapes. It's that Red escapes too. Not from Shawshank's walls, but from the belief that hope is something dangerous and foolish, a belief he's spent decades cultivating to protect himself from disappointment. Without the bus scene, Red's journey is incomplete. You see a man getting out of prison. With it, you see a man choosing to become free for the first time in his life. Those are very different films. Freeman has echoed this. He's described Red as someone who had built a fortress around his own heart because hope felt too painful to hold. The moment on that bus is the moment Red tears the fortress down. It is, in Freeman's view, the emotional climax of the film, more than any moment involving Andy. That scene almost didn't exist. Sit with that for a second. James Whitmore's portrayal of Brooks Hatlen runs for maybe 15 minutes of screen time. And yet the character is so essential to the film's meaning that its removal would gut the ending entirely. In King's original novella, Brooks is barely mentioned. Here's a footnote. Darabont saw something in that footnote that almost no one else would have. He saw an opportunity to show the audience what happens when the worst version of Red's fate plays out. When a man is so thoroughly shaped by institutional life that freedom becomes its own kind of prison. Brooks has spent 50 years inside Shawshank. Inside, he has purpose, status, a library, animals he cares for. The prison is strange and brutal, but it is known to him. It is home in the only way that word now applies to his life. When they release him, they call it freedom. He calls it something closer to erasure. The scenes of Brooks navigating the outside world, the supermarket, the rooming house, the park with the birds, are almost unbearable to watch because they are not dramatized. They're observed. Whitmore doesn't perform Brooks's disorientation. He inhabits it. And the moment he carves his name into the wooden beam above his bed, Brooks was here, isn't defiance. It's a man announcing his existence to a world that has already forgotten him. Darabont fought to keep this subplot when executives wanted it cut. His argument was simple. Without Brooks, Red's ending means nothing. The audience needs to see where the road leads when a man chooses fear over hope. When a man walks out of prison still imprisoned inside himself. Brooks shows you the stakes. He shows you what Red is choosing against when he finally decides to go find Andy. Red's addition to that carving, so was Red, before he leaves for Mexico, is one of the most quietly devastating and triumphant moments in the film. He is explicitly rejecting Brooks' ending. He is writing a different story for himself. But you only understand the full weight of that moment if you've watched Brooks's story play out completely. Bob Gunton's Warden Norton is one of cinema's great hypocrites. A man who quotes scripture while treating human beings as raw material. Who preaches salvation while building a personal empire on slave labor and corruption. It would be easy to dismiss him as a cartoon villain, a stock character from central casting. But Gunton has revealed in interviews that Darabont gave him research before filming began. Newspaper clippings. Historical records. Documentation of actual prison officials from mid-20th century America who presented themselves as pious, righteous, morally upstanding men while systematically exploiting the people in their care. The character of Warden Norton wasn't invented. He was assembled from real history. That context changes how you read the character. Norton's cruelty isn't random sadism. It's the specific cruelty of a man who has constructed an identity as a righteous person and cannot allow anything to threaten that construction. He doesn't just want power. He wants to believe he deserves power. He wants to be seen as good. And that need is what makes him genuinely dangerous, because it means he will do anything to maintain the illusion. When the police finally come for him, and he understands that everything is over, the look on Gunton's face isn't just fear of consequences. According to Gunton, it's the destruction of self-image. A man who has spent his entire career believing in his own righteousness cannot survive the moment that belief is publicly shattered. The gun he turns on himself is the last act of a man who would rather die as he lived than face the truth of what he actually was. Here's a production decision that most film scholars don't talk about enough, and it's one of the most quietly brilliant choices in the film's making. The final scene, the beach reunion between Andy and Red, was the first thing Frank Darabont shot. Before months of filming had passed. Before Robbins and Freeman had spent weeks building their on-screen relationship through prison yard conversations and quiet exchanges. Before the chemistry between them had fully developed. And that was intentional. Darabont wanted something specific in that final scene. He wanted the slight awkwardness of two people who love each other but haven't been in the same room for a long time. The tentative quality of reconnect ion. The moment where you're not sure how to begin because so much time has passed and words seem both necessary and completely insufficient. If he'd shot that scene at the end of production, after months of Robbins and Freeman working together every day, their comfort with each other would have bled into the frame. The reunion would have felt too easy, too warm, too immediate. By shooting it first, when they were still finding each other as collaborators, Darabont captured exactly the emotional texture that the scene required. Two old friends, separated by years and miles, moving toward each other across a beach, not quite sure how to close the gap, but moving anyway. It is a scene of almost unbearable gentleness. And it works the way it works because of a choice most viewers would never guess was made. Thomas Newman's score for The Shawshank Redemption is among the finest in American cinema. Most viewers know it instinctively, even if they couldn't name a single track. But very few people understand the structural choice Newman made that runs across the entire film. The score gets progressively more hopeful. Not dramatically. Not in a way your brain immediately registers. But emotionally, across 2+ hours, the music shifts. The early scenes in Shawshank carry a spare, almost mechanical sound. There's an austerity to it, a quality that feels like stone walls and routine and the absence of color. It's music that conveys confinement without showing you anything. By the film's final act, the orchestration has warmed. There are textures in the music that weren't there before, something closer to tenderness, to the feeling of light on skin after a long time in darkness. This progression mirrors Andy's journey exactly. And it mirrors Red's. The music smuggles hope into the film the same way Andy smuggles hope into Shawshank, slowly, patiently, one small increment at a time, until you look up and realize the whole atmosphere has changed. Newman's score was nominated for an Academy Award that year. It lost to another iconic score, Hans Zimmer's work on The Lion King. Film scholars have debated that outcome for 30 years. What's not debatable is that Newman's score for Shawshank is the rare movie music that functions as genuine storytelling rather than emotional instruction. It doesn't tell you how to feel. It creates the conditions in which feeling becomes possible. Let's return to 1994, because the story of what happened after Shawshank's theatrical failure is as remarkable as anything in the film itself. The movie disappeared from theaters quickly. By Hollywood metrics, it was done. But then something started happening that the studios hadn't anticipated. Cable television picked it up. Home video picked it up. TNT started running it, and people noticed that the ratings didn't drop with subsequent airings. They rose. People were watching it again. And then again. And then recommending it to people who watched it and called their friends and recommended it to people who watched it. The film built its audience the way Andy built his escape tunnel, 1 inch at a time, over years, in the dark, through sheer persistence. By the late 90s, something had shifted. Shawshank wasn't just a movie people liked. It was a movie people needed to share. There was a sense of almost evangelical enthusiasm around it, the feeling that something important was being missed by anyone who hadn't seen it. And a genuine desire to be present for someone else's first experience of the story. Morgan Freeman has reflected on this. He's noted the strange poetry in the way the film's life mirrored its themes. A story about patience, about taking the long view, about refusing to give up on something that the world had written off, found its audience through exactly those qualities. The film simply wouldn't accept being forgotten. By the early 2000s, Shawshank had reached the top of IMDb's user-ranked list of the greatest films ever made. It has remained near or at that position for over 2 decades, consistently outranking films that won Oscars, films that made fortunes, films that arrived to universal acclaim. A movie that opened to empty theaters somehow became the people's choice for the greatest film of their lifetimes. There's a final piece to this story that might be the most unexpected of all. The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, where most of the film was shot, is now one of the most visited tourist attractions in the state. Over 100,000 people travel there every year. They walk the same halls that Tim Robbins walked between takes. They see the cell that served as Andy's. They can examine the spot where the famous poster hung on the wall. Think about what that represents. A building that existed for over a century as a site of human suffering, a place that was ultimately shut down for cruelty, has been almost entirely reimagined in the public consciousness as the home of a story about the indestructibility of the human spirit. The community around Mansfield has embraced the film's legacy so fully that they created an entire trail of filming locations throughout the region, drawing visitors who boost the local economy and who come not for darkness but for something closer to pilgrimage. They want to stand in the places where hope was depicted. They want to feel whatever it is the film made them feel, but in 3 dimensions. Tim Robbins has called this transformation its own form of redemption. A place designed to break people now exists to celebrate a story about people who refuse to be broken. We're approaching 30 years since The Shawshank Redemption was released. In that time, the film industry has changed almost beyond recognition. Streaming has transformed what we watch and how. Franchises dominate the cultural conversation. The idea of a quiet, dialogue-driven drama about two men in a prison finding their way toward hope seems almost antique by current commercial standards. And yet the film doesn't feel antique at all. If anything, it feels more relevant, more necessary. Morgan Freeman, in various interviews over the years, has offered what might be the simplest and most accurate explanation for this. He says the film speaks to the part of every human being that understands imprisonment, not as a literal condition, but as a state of mind. The prison of circumstances. The prison of mistakes. The prison of believing that what you've already lost is all you were ever going to have. And the film doesn't offer easy comfort. It doesn't tell you that hope is simple or painless. One of Red's most famous lines in the film is that hope is a dangerous thing. He means it. He knows from experience what it costs to want something in a place that exists to take things away from you. The film acknowledges the terror of hope before it affirms its necessity. That honesty is part of why it cuts so deep. Tim Robbins has said that what he hopes people take from Andy Dufresne's story is not a simple lesson about perseverance, but something stranger and harder to articulate. The sense that there are parts of a person that cannot be reached by the world's cruelty if that person refuses to hand them over. Andy never gave Shawshank his interior life. He kept it sealed off, private, inviolable. The tunnel through the wall was real, but the more important tunnel was the one he dug through 19 years of dehumanization and kept his essential self intact on the other side. That's what the film is about. Not just escape. Not just redemption in the transactional sense. But the refusal to be reduced. The insistence on remaining a full human being in a place that profits from your degradation. And that story is not going to stop resonating. Not as long as people feel constrained by their lives. Not as long as the world has the capacity to make human beings feel small. Which is to say, not ever. So the next time you sit down to watch The Shawshank Redemption, which if you're anything like the rest of us will be sooner than you think, watch it differently. Watch the sky. Watch where the bars fall in the frame. Watch Andy's body language shift between his public and private selves. Listen to the music and notice how it has changed by the time you reach the end. And notice the moment when, for the first time in 2 hours and 22 minutes of storytelling, the sun finally comes out. Because when it does, you'll feel it the way the filmmakers always intended you to. Not just in your eyes. But somewhere deeper than that. If this gave you something new to think about, share it with someone who loves this film. Or better yet, share it with someone who hasn't seen it yet. Because there are still people out there who haven't had this experience for the first time. And that means there are still people out there who have no idea what's waiting for them. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And leave a comment below telling us the moment in this film that hit you hardest. We genuinely want to know.